memorize because they knew you were bored. So basically, if so much for the coloration. Oh, that's great. Pick a color. Okay. Stuff can move as normally what you think from cytoplasm to cytoplasm. It has to pass through the cell membrane. However, because of the cell wall, there's issues. So does anybody remember what that's called? Basically like a hole from cell to cell? Plasmodesmata. What would be analogous to in an animal cell?
Gap junction.
Gap junctions. The difference being the gap junctions are so tiny that they only let ions move through. Plasmodesmata are so big that whole proteins can go through. Okay? So big stuff can move through plasmodesmata. So, weirdly enough, okay, the cytoplasmic compartment is called the symplast. S-Y-M-P-L-A-S-T. So when things move from cytoplasm of one cell to cytoplasm of another to cytoplasm of the other directly, it's called symplastic movement. I know you couldn't have lived without that vocabulary word. Weirdly enough, though, does everybody get that? I mean, it's just more vocabulary for you to learn. Huh?
It's another word for
symplastic movement means when you have something, whether it be a protein or an ion, if it's moving from the cytoplasm of this cell directly to the cytoplasm of that through the plasmodesmata, it's called symplastic movement. Okay? Weirdly enough, though, the cell wall is not solid. It's made of, first of all, what?
Protein.
Not proteins. You know. Cellulose, which is a carb, and it forms kind of like these wheel-like structures, but there's lots of space in it. So it turns out that liquid moves through the cell wall, so stuff can actually transport cell to cell to cell straight through the cell wall. And the compartment of the cell wall is considered its own compartment then because it can house stuff. It's called the apoplast. Okay, A-P-O-P-L-A-S-T, the apoplast. Of course, the movement then, if it's moving from cell wall to cell wall to cell wall, is apoplastic movement. Okay? And then the last vocabulary is basically the compartment created by the vacuole cell membrane is called the tonoplast. Okay? Stuff cannot move, obviously, from this vacuole and jump straight into that vacuole. There is no tonoplastic movement. But stuff can move from the symplast into the tonoplast and vice versa. Okay? So the vacuole cell membrane is very specialized. It has, we really just kind of think of the vacuole as like this bag of membrane, but it has active transport pumps in it. It has lots of specific protein channels. So it can actually like super concentrate ions in it so that water will flow into the vacuole and cause turgor pressure. So it is a specialized compartment. Okay? I just try to get, since it's a new vocabulary word, some more pictures. So this is a water molecule or some kind of molecule. How is it moving?
Like a pinball.
Symplastically. Okay, symplastically. And how is this molecule moving? Apoplastically. I try to say both of those quick. And you can just see that the molecule can end up from this cell to this cell, either by moving through the symplast or through the apoplast. And here is yet a more realistic picture. And this is actually, we can come back to this. This is how water would get into the vascular system. Okay, it has to go through the dermal tissue, okay, that outside layer of epidermis, and then it has to pass through the cells, it has to pass through the ground tissue, and then it has to pass through what's called the endodermis into, and does anybody remember what the vascular is called in the root, because it's all together in the root. I know, we did cover it, but I didn't expect you to remember that. It's called the stele. Okay? So it moves into the stele. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you look at the pretty pink and blue, we have the apoplastic route of stuff moving through and the symplastic route. And what I want you to see is it can shift. Because here you have it moving apoplastically, and then it goes and moves into the symplast, and then it can move through that. Here it was moving apoplastically, it goes symplastically, here it was symplastic, and then it goes through the cell wall. So stuff can move, it isn't set, it can move both ways through all the cells. Yeah?
Is one like faster than the other?
I'm thinking symplastic movement has to be quicker because it's all soluble. It's in the cytoplasm, so it should be quicker. And the plasmodesmata, I just learned today, not that I really care that much about plants, but plasmodesmata, they've actually discovered that plants can narrow or make bigger their plasmodesmata to allow certain things to get through. So I don't know how that's controlled, but they discovered that. They actually discovered, like, they were finding that viruses were passing directly from one symplast to the other symplast of a plant cell. So it was moving from like that cell to that cell through the plasmodesmata. Well, viruses are pretty big. I mean, they're pretty small compared to cells. But molecularly, they're big because they're like a protein coat and they have DNA on the inside. And actually, they were secreting a chemical that made the plasmodesmata dilate and get bigger, and then the virus would just slip right through. And then they found out that plants can actually do that too by releasing chemicals.
Depending on the molecule, because you said it's basically molecules of the lateral movement. What were the?
Well, it's all molecules moving.
You know what I mean? Like, is it more of like water and nutrients? That
Both. Yeah.
Does it depend on like what it is that's moving? If it's going to do the symplastic or the apoplastic?
No. So like everything's dissolved in water, it won't move at all.
Mm-hmm.
So the water and like the mineral. I mean, what does a plant have to move around? Basically, maybe we should have started with that. When we say plant transport, like we understand what we have to move through our blood, and we did circulatory system, and you just took a test, so you better understand. But what does a plant have to move around? What does it have to transport? Water, sugar from the photosynthetic parts to the non-photosynthetic parts.
Enzymes.
Okay, amino acids to make proteins. Not too many, but you have to do that. ATP, remember, is only made in mitochondria and stays within the cell that makes it. So we don't transport ATP. What?
Like the G3 stuff?
Yeah, sugars. I mean, any derivative of sugar. Huh? Who? Minerals. So mostly water, minerals, and sugar. Water and minerals to the cells, sugar away from the photosynthetic cells, and one more thing that we transport as well, hormones.
How does like fertilizer work for like plant?
Fertilizer is basically mostly nitrogen containing, and that's the whole point of fertilizing. And we're going to actually talk about this next week, but crop growing is not a natural process. Plants growing are natural, but in nature, is there ever like a great big bunch of the same thing growing together and then it just all leaves? And then all the nitrogen that it sucked up out of the soil and all the water takes it with it? Right? If we take all our vegetables and sell them to China, what happened to all the nitrogen that was in the soil in Nebraska? It's in China. That nitrogen is now part of the plant, and we just sold it, and it's not here anymore. I mean, so the whole thing is it's not a natural process, so we have to find some way of replacing the nitrogen in the soil, because we just pulled the crops that took all the nitrogen up out of the soil, we just pulled them up and got rid of them. Normally, plants would die and decompose, and then the nitrogen would go back into the soil. So that's the whole issue why we fertilize, is to put the nitrogen back in the soil. Okay. So if we go back, we don't really need to look at this now because I think you guys all brought copies of this with you. This is just describing the apoplast, symplast, and tonoplast, and that you have lateral movement through those. Okay, so are we good on the lateral movement? That's really all there is to it.
Wait, question.
Yeah.
Is the water like filtered through the epithelial cells? So like that's what is it?
Yes, the endodermis, which actually, like this layer of cells right here, between the epidermis